Welcome to a brand new episode of the Clear to Send podcast. This is Francois. I'm here this morning with Rowell. Hey, Rowell, how are you?
Hello, good morning, everybody.
So, today we're back for another troubleshooting story. I don't know if it's a scary story, but it is a good story. And if you've missed the previous episodes, we recorded a couple of other troubleshooting stories that you can go back and listen to. But today, Rowell is telling us a story about another Wi-Fi issues. I'm not another Wi-Fi issue. I'm not going to say too much because I don't want to reveal the end of the story. But why don't you start, Roel, by telling us about the context and why the client called you for some bad Wi-Fi?
Yeah, I got called to troubleshoot a Wi-Fi network, and so I was doing this remotely. I wasn't even on site. And you imagine, like most Wi-Fi issues, we step on site, we go into this environment and try to do some troubleshooting down at the client level. And so in this environment, I was just told, "Hey, the Wi-Fi network isn't performing as well as they wanted it to in a multi-story building." And in this building, there were really two floors that were affected the most, and it was the sales floor and the customer support floor. And so when
Mhm.
I kind of dove in, I just looked at these two floors, and I was trying to figure out what device I could look at. Is there a particular device that has this issue more often than anybody else? And so I was given a few MAC addresses and took a look at them and could see that they were connected to the access points just fine. And these were mostly Mac laptops.
And
Um,
which vendor and which tool were you
yeah.
using to do that?
So this was on a Meraki system, a full Meraki stack with the MX firewall switches and access points. And these were
Mhm.
MR57 access points, so fairly new and fairly new Mac laptops as well. And when I started looking into the dashboard, because we've done like a really old episode about troubleshooting using the Meraki dashboard, and I went through those exact same things. Look at the event log, started looking at the client connectivity logs, seeing if they were just doing suboptimal roaming or whatnot. But most of these users were pretty stationary. They did all of their sales calls at their desk using an application to do these calls, but the application would constantly just fail on the call. So they could be in the middle of a sales call and then that call would just drop.
Mhm.
So imagine the frustration of some of these users who are trying to make their sales quotas just being dropped from a sales call. Maybe they were close to booking a meeting or something like that. And then even the customer support, they were helping people. And with the application, it would change a status of a support ticket to green, I think. And then all of a sudden it would reset. And so they would almost have to start all over again for support, or somebody else would have to take over that support call. So there's a lot of frustrated users at this point. And there are always a few things I look at with a Meraki network. The first thing is I always go and look at the channel widths for the access points, because if there's a ton of access points in this environment and they're all at 80 megahertz wide channels for 5 gig, then I usually go in and change that. The other thing that I always look at is client balancing, because every Meraki environment I've been in where they had client balancing always leads to poor performance, where Meraki access points just they deny the association. They just don't respond to a client. And so that always manifests to the user as I don't have any Wi-Fi, because they're just kind of their device is stuck. It's like trying to join to an access point, but that access point is just ignoring them in hopes that another access point would respond to that client. And so I turned that off because it was on. But eventually, like those, a lot of the issues just kind of went away, but the issues were still there. Just wasn't as prominent. but
Pronounced. Yeah.
but when a lot of people would show up to the office, and that issue would really bubble up big time. And so after I took a look at the Wi-Fi network, I was like, "Hey, there's throttling. There's some certain access rules where they only allow certain applications, but I couldn't really pinpoint it on that. Like I didn't have hard evidence that showed
Hmm.
this throttling was the issue, because the throttling wasn't super low. It was actually, I think they were throttling people to like 300 megs, which to me was actually
Hmm.
pretty high. Um, and so this is when I just started thinking, well, what if it wasn't a Wi-Fi issue? What if this was a different type of issue? Because when people were complaining, I said, hey, if you hardwire in, do you still see the issue or does it completely go away? And that's when somebody told me, yeah, the issues are still there when you're wired in. And actually, for the most part, there's a lot of people who wire in because of the like Zoom calls and the sales calls that they're making on this application. They would still drop. And so usually when somebody tells me that, I go, okay, well, if you lead with that, it's not a Wi-Fi issue. If you see that
Hmm.
issue both on wired and wireless, it's not a Wi-Fi. So a lot of the symptoms just appeared on Wi-Fi because most of the people were on wireless. And so where I
And that's,
started,
I think that's something we have to deal a lot with Wi-Fi, is that a lot of
yeah,
problems end up to us, even
hmm,
though it's not really a Wi-Fi issue. And so you really have to be trained to think outside of the box, because
yes,
if you're just looking at the Wi-Fi stuff, you can get stuck into logs, packets, thinking
yeah,
that you're gonna eventually gonna find the root cause, but the root cause might be outside of what you're looking at.
yes,
So, like, yeah, it's important in our uh, our case to, uh, of course, we have to listen to the users, but also look at the broader picture and try to understand, like you said, is it just the Wi-Fi, or is it also a wired issue that can help us to, yeah, troubleshoot.
and part of it is asking the right questions, right? A lot of times where where somebody says it's a Wi-Fi issue, I don't even ask the question like, "Do you see it on wired?" But in this case, when I couldn't find a smoking gun on the Wi-Fi network, I that's when I asked, like, "Hey, if your guys are hardwired in, do they have issues?" And they started mentioning Zoom rooms that were dropping off. Like if you were in a Zoom room and you had a meeting, the call would just drop. And so that's
Mhm.
when I was pretty sure this wasn't a Wi-Fi issue, but the problems just manifested into a Wi-Fi issue. And a lot of times when you're dealing with different environments, you tend to have these go-tos, right? You tend to have these common issues that you're looking at. And when I went to those, especially for, I just know Meraki very well, that I looked at very specific things and I didn't see a problem. Um, what's difficult with Meraki too is the event log is you kind of have to learn how to exclude a lot of events, right? So I see a lot of events that just don't matter for this environment, and I would just go in there and in the event log, I would just start excluding events that don't really they don't make a difference with the troubleshooting. That way I can kind of sift through the log and not have to scroll endlessly about looking for what might be sticking out. And so that kind of helped as well. And that's how I found the client balancing thing is I can see it's enabled, but a lot of times I will go into the event log and see how often an AP is not allowing an association. And that's when I decide to turn off client balancing. The other thing that I started doing is a network diagram. Like I knew that Meraki had their own network diagram, but it's more of a logical diagram, right? It just kind of shows you where a switch is connected to which other switch. And in this case, they had like multiple stacks of switches. And so I wanted to kind of look into that and see what might be happening when when there's lots of users. To me, whenever they say a lot of users come in and then they have issues, that to me points to maybe spanning tree or some sort of broadcast storm, usually when
Mhm.
I'm looking at a network. And so I started doing a network diagram, started doing it off with OmniGraffle. I started from the firewalls and I just started diagramming every connection. And so this is when I came across that every switch stack had dual uplinks to the core switch. And then even the internet to me was kind of weird. Like, the internet came in on one of the switch stacks, which then connected that switch stack connected to the core switch. So there was kind of a weird path to the internet, but I made sure that wasn't a problem. And then when I looked at the dual uplinks, I noticed that spanning tree was blocking some of the ports, but only from the stacked switches. And so when I looked at the core switch, every port was active. And so I wondered, which I couldn't tell from Meraki switches, if downstream from the core switches, if it was taking the wrong path and
Hmm.
going to a switch that had a port that was discarding due to spanning tree. And so I just made a decision for them because they're core switches. They had two of them, right? And every switch stack had two uplinks, one to each core switch. But the core switch themselves weren't stacked, and they weren't configured for like virtual switching or virtual chassis. And so since you have two stacks going to, or two uplinks going to
Hmm.
two separate switches, that would cause some sort of spanning tree loop. And so spanning tree has to kick in at some point and start discarding at ports. And so I told them like, hey, like the quickest fix for this, rather than being remote and then having to tell someone to rewire a bunch of cables, I just said, hey, as a quick fix with everybody there, why don't we just shut off one of the core switches? That way, all of the switches just go out of one core switch. And so I still had to look at which port on the core was a root port to the right switch for the uplink. And so
Hmm.
like having to deal with spanning tree, we don't deal with it as often. I
Yeah.
don't know how often you deal with it, Francois.
Not
But
very often. Yeah.
yeah, so I had to go back to my layer 2 and really make sure I understood spanning tree. But at this point, I just try to get rid of one switch that would cause a loop, which could be the core switch. And so after that, I think that was like on a Friday. Even then, I'm hesitant to like make changes that big on a Friday. But come Tuesday,
What's the big deal? We'll just turn off a core switch.
well, I said, okay, if this causes a catastrophe, our backup plan here is to just turn it back on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I said, turn it off. No one really came into the office on Monday. I think there were a few, but Tuesday was when everyone came in. And so I said, all right, Monday, if someone's in, can you just make sure that
Hmm.
everything's good? Then Tuesday, everyone came in, and I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear. I think I was in the middle of the day, and I had remembered, like, oh, I remember we shut off a core switch on Friday, so I like checked up on someone, like, hey, do you guys still have issues? Are you still having Wi-Fi problems since everyone's on the Wi-Fi network? And they were like, no, we haven't had any issues. Like Zoom calls are going, people are making sales calls, and supporting people. And I said, okay, so you had a misconfiguration on your network. Your uplinks are, oh, here. So because they have two uplinks, they weren't aggregating any of the links, right? You have to usually you aggregate the links as one logical link, even up at the
Hmm.
core level. And so I had to explain to them the network architecture and how they have to redo it, put the two core switches into a switch stack, and then start aggregating down to the other switches on the floors. And so that's kind of the next step in redoing that. So they're working off of one core switch, but they just have to turn on the other one if that
Hmm.
the current core switch fails. But it's just interesting how a lot of that shows up as Wi-Fi issues, because even let's say there was a loop on the network, and I didn't see that there was, that would extend to the Wi-Fi network,
Hmm.
um, and affect all those users. But I didn't have to do things like dynamic packet captures. I just looked at I go back to the OSI model and I go, okay, did I see an issue with layer 1, layer 2, and then I'll go up to layer 3 and start troubleshooting there. So really, I looked at layer 2 first, didn't see any issues, and then I looked at layer 1, which was the whole network diagram and how the switches were connected, and that's where I made my call to shut
Hmm.
off a core switch. And so it's just interesting how in the last month, most of my Wi-Fi issues are wired issues.
Yeah. Yeah. And it happens a lot, like you said, because Wi-Fi is the primary way for people to connect to the network. So if they feel like there's an issue, they're just going to say Wi-Fi. And
Hmm.
Wi-Fi, to be honest, Wi-Fi it doesn't always work. So people kind of default to Wi-Fi
Yeah.
being the issue,
Yeah.
um, thinking that it could be like some sort of interference or something.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's what they initially thought. They thought they had to add more access points, and I said, well,
mm,
before you buy more, they wanted to replace them all. And being a salesperson, that's kind of like the thing you want to hear, right? And I probably could have upsold them to the latest access point, but I said, hey, why don't we actually take a look at it first? Because if you buy equipment and you still have the same problem, that's not going to look
mhm.
good for
Yeah,
your to your manager and finance, and you're just wasting a lot of money. And so yeah,
I've
adding
seen.
access points is not always the answer.
Yeah, I've seen companies change Wi-Fi vendors because they were not happy with the Wi-Fi, and it turns out it's not a Wi-Fi issue.
Or at
Yeah.
least if you put in new access points with the right dashboard to tell you what's happening, you
Hmm.
could see what those issues are, right? And that
Hmm.
was kind of our the previous episode that we record, not the previous episode where we talked about when I added missed access points and it showed all these problems and they didn't
Hmm.
believe the dashboard. And so yeah, I mean, understanding layer 1 and 2 is super critical in today's networks, even though most people will really focus on layer 3 and what they want,
Hmm.
they automating the network. But if you can't get a good layer 1 and layer 2, the rest of the layers are all going to suffer.
Yeah, I think we learned this at the beginning, and then we follow this, and then up to a point where we think we have the experience, and we're like, "Oh, I know this. I know what this issue is," and then we get hung up into our own experience, and we
Yeah.
forget about the basics sometimes. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good thing to go back, especially when you do troubleshooting, where you have to be very methodical about what you do. You have
Hmm.
to go back to these basic rules.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, Roel, thank you for sharing another great troubleshooting story. Well, keep on listening because we might be back with more stories in the future. Thank you for listening and have a good week.
All right. See you guys.